Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next panel on virtue and social fabric. I'm joined today by Elizabeth Shaw and Patrick Hough. We're missing our third panelist, Ann Snyder. She was unfortunately delayed by the tide and missed her flight here today. But we're going to continue on, and I'm very excited to welcome my two colleagues up here. And I think we'll start with Elizabeth. You want to start with Patrick? All right.
Is that okay? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, can everyone hear me okay on this? Yes? No?
A little closer.
Little closer? Yeah? I'll huddle forward. I knew a Dominican preacher who once gave all of his homilies hunched over the pulpit, and it's always good to copy Dominicans. First, thanks to my dear friend John Henry and his colleagues at the project, and to all of you for taking the time out of very busy summers to form an intellectual and spiritual community. John Henry was very kind to reach out with his invitation, and I don't normally accept these invitations. I'm not a scholar or an author or a teacher. In fact, I think John Henry knew that even if I had applied to the seminar, I wouldn't have made the cut. So this is the only way to get me out here, and so this explains why I'm up here, and so it probably means I should say something. It's unfortunate that Anne could not join us. I was really looking forward to her reflections on character formation in contemporary society. But I could not be more pleased to be here with Dr. Shaw, and I'm excited to learn from her remarks on social, cultural, and political renewal in the thought of the great Michael Novak. My remarks will venture a bit beyond the reading from MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals found in your reading packet, which is a text that I try to understand from afar. If any of you have worked closely with a MacIntyre scholar, a real MacIntyre scholar, it can be very intimidating to cite anything from After Virtue or anything like this. And I work very closely with a real MacIntyre scholar. So if you were here today, you would not have read Dependent Rational Animals, and I would not be talking about it. With a philosopher and a social entrepreneur on the panel, I could not help but feel that this delightful little word, fabric, from the Latin faber, meaning to do or make, might be left alone and abandoned. There are other more contemporary phrases we could use, of course, social networks, social structures, but I suspect that we feel that something would be missing. I believe we would be right. I've spent much of my career attending and organizing discussions and consultations that in one way or another touched upon the need to, quote, maintain the social fabric. Some things, quote, tore it apart. Others, quote, held it together. And with the social fabric was made up naturally of, quote, the threads of people's lives, unquote. But with that, it reached the point of exhaustion and departed, often to join the pantheon of its metaphorical peers, building, sailing, farming, warfare, medicine, metallurgy, into poetic obscurity. Indeed, it is almost as if we are not supposed to take such metaphors seriously. Indeed, they might be dangerous to do so. Metaphors have the ability to show and tell in powerful, secret ways, but only with proper attentiveness and stewardship. So how do we come upon this idea of social fabric? Well, it seems to me that its likely origins is in The Statesman, Plato's late dialogue examining political society and the nature of an excellent ruler. A very different text than the Republic, if you've read it. Says the mysterious stranger in the dialogue, what model is there which is small and yet has any analogy with the political occupation? Suppose, Socrates, that if we have no other example at hand, we choose weaving, or more precisely, the weaving of wool. This will be quite enough, without taking the whole of weaving, to illustrate our meaning. Indeed, the entire argument of this dialogue is built upon the exhaustive working out of this analogy. Considerations of shepherding, shearing, carding. Carding, we know what carding is. Process of removing foreign fibers from the sheep's fleece, spinning, and finally, weaving, all held against their social and political analogs. The king's art is a weaving art, providing the end and ordering principle of social and political life. Plato concludes that if we want social fabric, we better have a weaver. We better have a king. Again, very different from the Republic. And like Plato, what we expect of our theories of social fabric is order, stability, and a dynamic life in accord with our nature. I assure you, this is not a talk about Catholic integralism. I have my own reasons for wanting to take the metaphor of fabric seriously. When my grandfather was not tending to the small post office of Stony Creek, Connecticut, he was training border collies and raising Hampshire sheep in Brantford, Connecticut. My mother was a weaver and a spinner, and back home I have a pasture filled with Icelandic sheep myself. I have the lovely memory of my mother weaving on this massive Shetland loom, about 8 feet across and 10 feet tall. And I was small, and I would run underneath the beams. And as you would see me run, you would hear, this was when I was about 2, you would hear bump, 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 as my head hit each of the beams as I ran along. I would fall asleep with my sister under loom, and my mother's legs would push the pedals down. And when we weren't looking, there was a fabric in between us. It would come crashing on our backs, and we would startle up and everything like this. Well, these bumps there's a serious side to them, I think, because it reminds me that there's another, dare I say it, thread to this weaving metaphor from the ancient world. Its darker hue and rougher texture sets it apart. It is in some sense the mirror image of our idea of social fabric. Rather than using the language of weaving arts to describe social and political life, narratives of weaving, stories of weaving, people weaving are used to communicate deep secrets of the human mind and heart. Some of you have already guessed where this story begins. The poet Hesiod, in his Theogony, describes the Moirai, 3 daughters of the goddess Night, Clotho, who spins out the thread of each human life, Lachesis, who measures out his or her share of misery and fortune, and finally Atropos, who with the cut of her shears bestows death on all men and women. Their judgments are inscrutable, their decisions final. For the poet, human society is indeed made up of the interweaving of the individual threads of human life. But in the fates, we hardly find the order and stability that we seek in our social fabric. Rather, society is where humanity lives out its days, powerless before the arbitrariness of fortune and the tyranny of time. It continues in the myth of Arachne, as told by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. The talented and beautiful Arachne, in a moment of pride and impiety, challenges the goddess Athena to a weaving competition. Into her glorious cloth, the goddess weaves great tales of humanity's pride and downfall before the gods. Arachne, for her part, tells the tales of the gods' follies, silly loves and defeats. Upon being bested by the mortal, in her divine rage, Athena turns Arachne into the mother of all spiders, forever cursed to perform her art to capture her prey. Impiety is always punished. Let's consider 3 more women. Throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer repeatedly uses weaving to announce the themes of powerlessness, loss, and death. We find beautiful Helen weaving in the recesses of the Trojan palace as men's feats of arms and the scheming of the gods decide her fate. As Hector faces his death at the hand of Achilles, gentle Andromache quietly sits at her loom. Upon hearing the cries of the city, she drops her shuttle and flees the chambers to receive the dreadful news of his destruction. And finally, Penelope, wife of Odysseus, she keeps her suitors at bay as she weaves her husband's burial shroud in the desperate hope that he may still be alive. Working at the loom by day and undoing the threads by night, a wonderful parody of the 3 fates. Homer, I think, reveals an important aspect of these anxieties and sorrows. They often take place in the domestic spheres of our life, both literally and figuratively, in our homes, in our interior lives. In this classical poetic weaving tradition, a different social fabric, In spite of our divine spark of will and reason, philosophical weaving, that is, humanity stands hopeless before the crushing force of time and the whims of fate, subject to the capriciousness of divine anger and punishment, and forever aware of the inevitable loss of our deepest loves and, eventually, of our own lives. Humanity is overwhelmed by the givenness of our lives, those dimensions over which we have little or no control. As a side, I would like to suggest that in my work with young men and women in what are referred to as elite institutions, this pagan weaving tradition is making a return. At a time when, we'll talk about this more tomorrow with John Henry, but at a time when students feel more and more in charge of their lives, more and more concerned about career and merit and technical skill, this poetic tradition is making a tremendous comeback and devastating comeback. And so before us, we have two traditions: the weaving of philosophy, constructive, ordering, governing, and the weaving tradition of the poets, passive, arbitrary, and static. Both, it seemed to me, have their truths and virtues, falsehoods and vices. I could literally just continue going on through the Old Testament, Genesis, Job, Isaiah, and continue to trace especially this poetic and weaving metaphor. But let's jump to St. Paul. Writing to the Colossians, he declares, "I want you woven into a tapestry of love, in touch with everything there is to know about God." This is a promising start. This feels like we can get some philosophical weaving up and running here. But what is to be known? Who is to be known? He continues, "Then you will have minds confident and at rest, focused on Christ, God's great mystery." It is precisely in the divine entering of time, the life, passion, and death and resurrection, right? This is actually where we were. In another person's anxieties, in another person's death, in another person's suffering, right? Another person's penetration of human time, right? This is actually where we find our state of mind that is confident and at rest. It seems to me this is a new type of social and philosophical and indeed poetic weaving. It also seems to me, a non-philosopher and a non-scholar, that reconciling these two traditions in our Christian philosophy is one of the most important projects to be done today. And some of the more important developments in these projects have taken place, I think, in the last century. Early in Person in the Common Good, I think it's chapter 2, I believe Jacques Maritain makes the distinction between the individualism of dualism and the personalism that flows from the composite unity of the human person, body and soul. And he notes, almost in passing, that the full human person is often most manifest to us, not in radical states of flourishing and success and accomplishment, but in suffering and misfortune. Beyond Maritain's integral humanism, it seems to me that an appreciation for the fundamental importance of human finitude and dependency is found throughout the phenomenological personalist tradition, but there are many greater minds than my own who can speak with authority on that here. It is the particular thesis of MacIntyre's work, Dependent Rational Animals, the first chapter of which is included in your reading today. You need to read the rest of it if you haven't. It is difficult to fully appreciate the seriousness of MacIntyre's point. He observes that childhood and old age play little or no part in Aristotelian virtue ethics. There's no thought given to the youth of the magnanimous man or what he looks like in his final years of radical dependency, of deterioration, of becoming senile, of being unable to walk. How is that man magnanimous? Similarly, disability and other forms of dependency that spring from our bodily natures play little role in Aristotle's thought. Rather, the virtuous man is independent and indeed largely aloof from praise, criticisms, and the sufferings of his fellow men. Not to turn to the controversies of yesterday's session on sexuality, but we should note that MacIntyre locates this impulse in Aristotle's thought in a certain overemphasis on Hellenic masculine virtue. We may, in the quiet of this room, refer to a Aristotelian toxic masculinity. McIntyre sees this as a corruption, or at least a deviation for Aristotle's own understanding of the human person as a composite unity of body and soul. Our bodiliness, which brings with it our existence in time and space, our relationship with fortune and contingency, our need for sexual generation, sustenance, clothing, shelter, etc. That body is a human body. These dependencies, in many ways, are the source of our poetic weaving tradition. Their existence, both our own and others, in a certain way, constitute the life of a truly independent soul and our philosophical weaving. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's very fine remarks. I thought it might be appropriate in Anne's absence to spend a few minutes just talking about the selection that she had included in the reader, just so that's out there in this conversation for this panel. Of course, her focus is on the theme of character, and she identifies the fundamental question, namely, how do people become who they are? Let me read quickly. This is on page 156 in the reader. How do people become who they are? Put normatively, what are the pathways to forming the will, the mind, and the heart and soul of an individual such that he or she will be equipped to navigate life's vicissitudes with equipoise, courage, hope, and a loving knowledge of the good? What makes a great citizen, a faithful wife, an attentive father, an obedient yet curious child, a devoted teacher, a tireless and kind custodial staffer, a persevering student, a resilient soldier, a wise CEO, a prudent president? Okay, so this is a question for everyone, right? And astutely points to the centrality of institutions. Another briefer quote on the next page, toward the end of the page. The question of the hour is, what characterizes those institutions that not only form us to be individuals of character, but also mold us into the sort of people who are faithful spouses, responsible parents, generous neighbors, self-governing citizens, resolute in a crisis and gracious at a picnic? Okay. So in pointing to institutions and organizations, we're pointing to something really important, namely those bodies that fill the space of what we call civil society. That important space between the individual and the state, okay? And it's that space and the bodies that fill that space that are really essential for fostering character. Okay, that's Anne's argument, and that's one I would stand behind too. And when we get to Michael Novak, he's 100% in that camp as well. Now, I would add, don't need to belabor this point, but we all know how important families are. The family is the first school for a lot of things, including virtue or character. It's where virtue is taught by being modeled, encouraged, incentivized, practiced, prayed for. Okay, but beyond families, other groups and communal settings are vitally important in much the same way, of course. Our neighborhoods, our parishes, our volunteer groups, and especially I would include our workplaces, where we work. Okay, each of these places, each of these spaces is a place or a space for growing, cultivating, fostering virtue, character. And the flip side is true as well. Think about this, especially in our workplaces, I think. Each of these places can be a place that promotes or fosters or cultivates our vices, right? In academia, it's painfully true, right? In academia, our vices emerge in quite distinctive and poignant ways. For example, prideful self-promotion, excessive use of jargon that obscures rather than reveals the truth, gossip, and my personal favorite, the one I really love to hate, absent-mindedness. Okay, it's not a virtue. All right. So the workplace it's a place where most of us spend most of our time, most of our hours of the day, and it's something we ought to be really mindful about. What's going on there? But Anne's piece is about institutions, right? And particularly, she's done a really great, important study about institutions that are moving people in the opposite direction, toward virtue, toward character. And I like how she concludes this piece. I'm going to quote again, by noting that there are two different ways of defining character. This is on page 158 in the reader. It's just at the bottom of the page on 158. The individualistic view, which is one that tends to be concerned with behaviors like honoring one's word, comporting oneself with civility and even-handedness, persevering when the going gets tough, when going is rough, thinking about the long-term consequences of one's actions. And then the second is the communitarian view, one that understands character in terms of a broad set of spiritual and moral longings that can only be satisfied through a web of vibrant communities that foster loving relationships, inspiring ideals, a system of accountability, and some greater purpose. Okay, and then she also notes the first view honors the power of human agency, the second, the power of structural conditions. Okay, and having noted those two different ways of defining or thinking about character, Anne advocates for not an either or, but a both and approach. Somewhere, I'm quoting again, I wrote this one down, somewhere between our need for traditional character builders and our longing for innovative community makers is where this inquiry needs to begin, and actually where American renewal has always begun. So I just wanted to lay that out there as representative of Anne's piece. And now I'm going to move into my discussion, what I had prepared, and what I'm going to do here is largely to offer you a presentation that basically tracks with the reading selection that I offered for this portion of the reader. Just give you in advance a sort of sketch, 4 points, what I'm going to intend to lay out here. One, I'm going to identify the idea of democratic capitalism and explain how it's more than politics and economics. Second, I'm going to introduce the term moral ecology, which I see as a restatement of the social fabric idea. Then third, I'm going to offer a brief Aristotelian Thomistic tangent. And fourth, I will conclude with a note about the historical and empirical record that I think vindicates, or Novak thinks vindicates, his view of democratic capitalism. So the reading selection that I offered for this portion of the reader is a short article by Michael Novak. Michael Novak was an important figure in contemporary Catholic thought, friend of the Hildebrand Project, participated in these seminars in the past. Recently deceased. He died back in 2017, February. I worked with him for 8 years, so I was quite close to him. And when issues and themes come up, my mind sort of instinctively goes to this or that piece of his writing that's sort of relevant. So that's how I sort of came to him on this topic of social fabric. He wrote prolifically and broadly in the areas of theology, politics, social philosophy, and elsewhere. So. His best known and probably most influential book was published in 1982 under the title The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. This article that is in the reader is a short piece that was published in First Things, and It is actually a distillation and an adaptation of a larger retrospective piece that Novak was asked to write on the 30th anniversary of the publication of The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. So we may think of this piece as Novak's thought on democratic capitalism really in a nutshell. So it's valuable if you want to just read something really quick, really brief, and understand where he's coming from, what he's trying to say. So what's democratic capitalism? What's the idea of the spirit of democratic capitalism? Well, the key to understanding it is first to understand that Novak articulates that there are three spheres of liberty essential to a free society. One is political, the second is economic, and the third is what we may call moral/cultural. These three spheres are domains of liberty, essential to a free society. So right off the bat, we note that democratic capitalism means a lot more than just politics and economics. It's a lot more than political economy. It's a lot more than democracy plus capitalism. Okay, it's two words, but it's more than that. So the basic idea is that all three dimensions of human activity, of human living, ideally of human flourishing, are crucial. All three require our attention, our thoughtfulness, our care. Okay, and Novak offers the image of the three-legged stool. You may have heard this before. Think of a three-legged stool. You've got a seat and the three legs, right? And if one fails, the whole thing fails, right? If one fails, the other two come crashing down. Okay, so that's a good image to understand the big picture here. So quick descriptions of each of these domains of liberty. Political liberty. This means constitutional systems characterized by things like free elections, checks and balances, legal institutions protecting human rights and economic activity. Okay. Economic liberty. What we're talking about here are commercial systems in which individual persons, through their ingenuity, hard work, prudent decision-making, etc., individual persons are the drivers of business activity. Okay. And the third domain of liberty, the moral/cultural. Okay. Novak, I'm quoting from the piece that's in the reader, he refers to this as liberty in religion and conscience, in arts and sciences, and in cultural expression. I mean, so it's a big, broad field, right? Now, these three systems, these three domains are irreducible. Each is distinctive and can't be explained in terms of either of the others. And the three are, once again, interdependent, okay? Each depends on the other two. Right. And yet, it's fair to say that there's a priority that we should focus on when thinking of the third domain, the moral cultural sphere. I don't think it's a hard argument to make that it is foundational. It comes first. Upon it rests the success of the other two. So, while some 18th century thinkers inaugurated the study of what we call political economy, what's deeper and arguably a more important study is what Novak and others have called the science of moral ecology. Okay, so this is getting into my second point here, moral ecology. This idea is a study, an inquiry into the conditions that best support and promote human flourishing. It's sort of a big, broad description of what we're talking about here. Now, implicit in the articulation of such a science is the idea that certain conditions are, in fact, better for cultivating, among other things, the habits and virtues, the character necessary for a free society, and that other conditions are manifestly worse at doing that job. And I want to suggest now that this idea of science of moral ecology, the idea of moral ecology, is roughly equivalent to the social fabric idea restated. Okay. Our habits, our virtues, our good character, indeed, more importantly, virtuous men and women. These things do not arise in a vacuum. They don't come about spontaneously. They don't create themselves ex nihilo. They don't call themselves into being. Nothing does that in creation, right? So here's where I want to, just sort of, as I was sketching this out, at this point my mind went off on the what I'm calling the Aristotelian Thomistic tangent. So permit me a moment for this. In Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we know that Aristotle states that while virtue is what we are made for, every one of us, most of us won't get there on our own, right? And that is because virtue means mastering some passions, some appetites, these natural things that happen to be in us as fallen creatures. Well, you didn't speak in terms of fallenness, but these natural appetites and desires that are just happen to be in us and are quite powerful. And on our own, we just can't overcome them. Okay, so we need something extra, something outside of ourselves to work on us, to get us to the state of mastering those things. And Aristotle identifies that something extra as laws, good laws. We need, and good customs too. Okay, so virtue, our virtue, the virtue that we're made for, what's our fulfillment, the key to our eudaimonia, etc. This thing arises only in a social context. Only when and where we have some form of community that creates laws. Okay, and laws, interestingly, have two parts to them, right? The rule, or the guide for action, do this, okay? That's the first part. And the second is the threat of punishment, or else. You will be fined, you will be thrown into prison, whatever. Okay, so there's two laws, all good laws have those two things, right? And so laws work by training us, training both our reason and our desires and appetites. Okay, do this or else, all right? So laws first play off of our fear of punishment for the most part. Okay, laws get us accustomed to behaving in certain ways because we don't want to be punished. And only after a certain amount of time of repetitively behaving in those certain ways do we come to appreciate the reasonableness of behaving in those ways. And then in turn, we come to find those behaviors desirable in themselves and not just desirable as ways for avoiding punishment. Okay. So the laws train both our heads and our hearts. They get our reason lined up correctly and our appetites and desires lined up correctly. Now, I think it's at this point, I was going back and thinking about Anne's piece, and I think this is where a brief comment about Anne's part fits in here. Beyond the government, beyond the laws, institutions of civil society serve to do this as well, importantly, okay, and probably more effectively, in fact. But that's something for broader discussion, okay. So, back to Novak's piece and the historical empirical record. Novak's argument, and I'm not inclined to disagree with him. Maybe some people are, but his argument is that humanity has done best, flourished most. Now, never achieved perfection, but done best, flourished most, under regimes that best approximate the ideals of democratic capitalism. That is to say, political freedom and economic freedom. But most important of all, those two things grounded in a moral, cultural sphere that respects and promotes the human person, respects and promotes human dignity. Right? Let me again read a few quotes from his text. I'd rather hear other people's voices than mine. So this is on page 161 in the Reader. Quoting from John Paul II. This is Novak's quoting John Paul II. So, it is precisely the ability to foresee both the needs of others and the combinations of productive factors most adapted to satisfying those needs that constitutes another important source of wealth in modern society. Many goods cannot be adequately produced through the work of an isolated individual. They require the cooperation of many people in working towards a common goal. Organizing such a productive effort, planning its duration and time, making sure that it corresponds in a positive way to the demands which it must satisfy, and taking the necessary risks. All this, too, is a source of wealth in today's society. Now, before I got into these quotes, I should have said they're kind of, I'll say a word that sort of pulls them all together and collects them under one piece of logic after I say them all. Second quote, this is on page 162 in the Reader, the first full paragraph, just real briefly, free markets are dynamic and creative because they are open to the dynamism and creativity intrinsic to our humanity. Okay, that's the second one. And then the third one that I'll pull is on page 163. Again, well, second paragraph here. A society can barely survive under a hostile economic system driven by cupidity, envy, and smothering control by the state. We saw as much in the 1980s, which was why so many socialists abandoned socialist or quasi-socialist modes of government control. Nor can it survive under a hostile polity, contemptuous of truth, justice, law, and beauty. It will fall into lassitude and nihilism unless it maintains its longing for the transcendent, its upward thrust into the future, and the highest aspirations of the human heart. As Tocqueville saw, without that upward thrust, belief in the inviolable dignity of every single person will not survive, nor will respect for truth in public discourse. Belief in immortality and the certainty of divine judgment are indispensable supports of public virtue, our founders thought. In other words, an economy without beauty, love, human rights, respect for one another, civic friendship, and strong families is not long to be loved, not likely long to be loved or to survive. All right, those quotes are sort of, how do we collect those things? And we could pull other ones as well. But I think we can reflect on each of those. We take a little bit more time than we have here, and come to at least one bottom line, which is it is the human person. It is a sound philosophical anthropology, a grasp of human nature, that's foundational. Okay? Most important of all, a culture needs to articulate, to defend the ends and aspirations of human life. And those things necessarily transcend the material dimensions of our being. And when a culture does so, through its political, economic, and other social institutions, and this is where ANPEACE fits in too, the other social institutions and activities, it's there and only there that we see the greatest record of success in human history. Last quote. I think. Yeah, this is Novak's final paragraph on 164. We are very far from having built the kingdom of God on earth. but we have dramatically reduced poverty, shown ways to build institutions that respect human rights and liberties, virtually eliminated famines, found ways to prevent and remedy diseases, dramatically increased the longevity of people everywhere, and come to include more and more persons in the circle of exchange. But that too has not yet been achieved in full. There still remain about 1 billion persons on Earth not yet included. For their sake, and for everyone else's, the project of democratic capitalism must continue. Thank you.